A trembling hand gripped my wrist before I could even manage a whisper. The front door swung open just wide enough for my grandmother, Alara, to pull me inside with a surge of strength that seemed impossible for her age. The moment I crossed the threshold, she slammed the door, threw the heavy deadbolt, and immediately engaged two secondary locks I hadn't even realized existed. "Come in, quick," she breathed, her voice betraying a deep, jagged tremor. "Don't let them see you anywhere near this porch." I stared at her, my heart hammering against my ribs, unable to process the panic in her eyes. "Grandma, who are you talking about?" She didn't offer a word of explanation. Instead, she scrambled to the front window, yanking the heavy curtains shut so forcefully that every trace of the afternoon sun was choked off. Her breathing was shallow and ragged, and her hands, usually so steady, were shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed her shoulders, desperation rising in my throat. "Grandma, please, what is going on here?" She turned to face me, her eyes wide, glassy, and filled with a raw, primal terror. "Be quiet," she hissed, her finger pressed sharply against her lips. Before I could demand another answer, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunched against the wooden porch boards. Then a voice cut through the silence, a voice that made my blood run cold. "Mom, it's me." My stomach dropped through the floor. It was my father. He knocked twice, his rhythm casual, almost performative. "Mom, I know you're in there, I've got the groceries." Every single muscle in Alara's body locked into place. She pointed frantically toward the shadows of the hallway, a silent command for me to vanish from sight. I had come by unannounced because a gnawing sense of unease had been haunting me for months. My father had been adamant, insisting that Grandma preferred solitude, that she was becoming overwhelmed by the world, and that we all needed to give her space. I had blindly trusted him. Now, I was cowering in her dark hallway while she acted as if the man outside was a predator about to tear our lives apart. He tried the doorknob, rattled it once, then knocked again, harder this time. "Mom?" Alara pressed her hand against her mouth, her gaze locked on the door as if she were trying to hold back an explosion. We stood there, suspended in a suffocating silence, holding our breath until our lungs burned. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally retreated, followed by the heavy thud of a car door and the retreating growl of an engine. Only then did Alara collapse against the wall, her hand trembling as she lowered it. If you find yourself captivated by this tense, emotional unraveling of a family's deepest secrets, you are in the perfect place. Welcome to Karma Tales, a channel dedicated to these powerful, twist-filled narratives that explore the complex realities of life and justice. If this story resonates with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. We post these intense, thought-provoking stories every single week, and you won't want to miss what we have in store next. Join our community today and never miss an update. I stepped cautiously into the living room, finally able to scan the space, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. Something was horribly wrong. The mantel, once crowded with vibrant family photographs, was now barren, leaving behind ghostly, faded rectangles on the wallpaper where frames had rested for decades. A stack of mail sat on a side table, thick with dust, many of the envelopes yellowed and clearly untouched for years. Corners of the room that my grandmother had always kept immaculate were now choked with grime. My eyes caught on something else, a thick, bulging folder wedged beneath a sofa cushion, hidden with obvious haste. "Grandma," I said, my voice barely audible, "why were you hiding me from Dad?" She remained silent. Instead, she moved like a ghost across the floor, checking the front window one last time before turning to lock the back door for good measure. "You haven't answered a single one of my calls in months," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Dad told everyone you just didn't want visitors anymore." She closed her eyes, and the sheer weight of her exhaustion seemed to make her shrink. "I know exactly what he told you," she replied, her words carrying the heavy finality of a confession. "You know?" She gave a slow, fragile nod. "So, all this time, you actually wanted me to come?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Yes," she whispered, and a cold, sharp dread settled deep in my chest. If she had been waiting for me all along, then who had been intercepting my messages? Grandma glanced toward the hidden folder, but refused to reach for it. She stepped closer until the distance between us vanished, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. We don't have much time. I blinked, confused. Time for what? She looked toward the door with an intensity that suggested she expected my father to kick it down at any moment. Then, she spoke the sentence that shattered my world. Your father can never know you were here today. I looked at her in total disbelief. My father? You're telling me I have to hide from my own flesh and blood? Elara listened intently to the silence outside, verifying that Victor's car was truly gone before speaking again. Yes, she said, the single word carrying a lifetime of suffocated fear. I shook my head, fighting the truth. Grandma, none of this makes sense. Dad has been taking care of you. He told the whole family you needed peace and rest. He's made sure everyone believes exactly that, she countered. I searched her face for signs of age-related confusion, for any flicker of memory loss, but her eyes were piercingly clear. He decides who enters this house, Elara explained, her voice steady now. He decides who calls, which doctor I see, what papers I sign, and even when I'm allowed to step outside. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, she said, walking to the small table by the sofa and picking up a bundle of envelopes tied with a worn ribbon. These are yours. I untied the ribbon. Every single envelope was addressed in her elegant, familiar handwriting, yet each one had been returned or never sent at all. I wrote to you over and over, she whispered. I sat in stunned silence as I flipped through them. I never received a single one. I know, she said, gesturing toward the telephone on the table. Pick it up. I lifted the receiver to my ear, dead silence. There isn't even a dial tone, I realized. He told me I didn't need a phone anymore because he handles everything. I set the receiver back down, the reality of the situation beginning to suffocate me. None of this aligned with the man I thought I knew. Then Elara opened a kitchen cabinet and pulled out several prescription bottles. I never agreed to take these, she admitted. He tells the doctors what I need, and sometimes the medications are changed without me ever knowing why. I stared at the labels, unable to discern the truth, only seeing the fragments of a life SYSD. Elara froze instantly, the pill bottles slipping from her fingers and rattling across the counter like gunfire. She didn't move until the sound of the engine had completely faded into the distance. I had never seen my grandmother terrified of a passing vehicle. Grandma, tell me the truth. What aren't you telling me? Without a word, she moved to the sofa, reaching for the hidden folder I had noticed earlier. Her fingers brushed the edge of it, but just then, a pair of bright headlights swept across the front window. Elara jerked her hand back, her face draining of all color as she stared at the door. I followed her gaze, the question echoing in my mind. Was my father simply a man obsessed with control, or had he buried something much darker under the guise of family duty? The next morning, I made a choice that would change everything. We aren't hiding today, I told her as I helped her into her coat. If Dad wants the world to believe he's just a devoted son taking care of his aging mother, then he won't expect to see you walk in on my arm. Elara hesitated, her hands shaking. He'll be there, she warned. You already knew that. He's always there. We arrived at the bank just before the scheduled appointment. The lobby was quiet, and a familiar, practiced smile greeted us almost immediately. Mom, Victor said, his voice dripping with false warmth as he strode toward us. I wasn't expecting you to bring company. He embraced Elara before she could even recoil, then turned to me with an effortless, arrogant confidence. What a surprise, he said, his eyes scanning me. You should have told me you were stopping by. I forced a tight smile. It wasn't planned. No, he replied, studying me for a moment, clearly not. An employee approached, beaming. Mr. Victor, we're all ready for you and your mother. I caught the phrasing immediately. Not Mrs. Elara. Not both of them. Just him. Victor led the entire interaction as if he were the sole owner of the situation. Inside the office, the banker laid out several documents. Elara, Victor said, his tone saccharine, these are the routine papers we went over yesterday. Grandma reached for them, but Victor cut her off with a dismissive, reassuring laugh. You've already seen these, Mom. The banker smiled sympathetically at me. Your son has been wonderful, making sure everything is handled so smoothly. I watched my grandmother shrink back into her chair, her spirit momentarily crushed. I haven't actually read them, Alara said softly. Victor sighed, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Some days are just better than others, aren't they? The room fell into an oppressive silence. The implication was clear: dementia. I looked at the employees, but no one challenged him. They only looked at Alara with pitying concern. Victor turned to me, his face a mask of disappointment. You know how difficult this has become. She's been forgetting entire conversations lately. I glanced down at the paperwork while he droned on. One signature line caught my eye, and my heart stopped. The date on the document didn't match the top of the form, and the signature itself, supposedly my grandmother's, looked jagged and stiff, a poor imitation of the handwriting she'd used on my birthday cards for 20 years. Can I see that? I asked, reaching out. Victor smoothly slid the papers away, his smile never wavering. 7. Legal paperwork isn't really your concern, dear. It becomes my concern if Grandma doesn't understand what she's signing, I retorted. His expression hardened just for a flicker of a second. She understands, she just needs help remembering. The banker nodded in agreement. We've worked with Mr. Victor for quite some time now. We trust his judgment. I realized with a sickening jolt that I was the outsider here. Everything I said sounded like paranoia. Everything he said sounded like saintly devotion. As the meeting concluded, Alara stood slowly, and as Victor turned to thank the staff, she slipped something cold into my palm, a small brass key. Our eyes locked for a heartbeat. Don't ask here, her look pleaded. I closed my fingers around the key without a word. Outside, Victor rested a heavy hand on my shoulder. See? You were worried for nothing, he said with a condescending grin. Mom is in very good hands. I looked at him, then at the key hidden in my palm. For the first time in my life, I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't trust a single word that came out of his mouth. That evening, after Victor had finally left, I unlocked the old desk drawer with the brass key. Inside were meticulously organized copies of legal documents, documents that proved he had been systematically dismantling her life. Grandma looked over my shoulder, the color draining from her face as she saw them. I never signed any of these, she whispered. I spread the documents across the dining room table while Alara disappeared, returning moments later with an old, heavy metal box. If we're going to compare them, use these, she said, her voice shaking. Inside were her genuine records, old wills, insurance forms, and birthday cards, the true, fluid signature of my grandmother. I placed them side by side with the bank's documents. The difference was undeniable. The authentic signatures flowed with life. The ones Victor had provided were hesitant, copied stroke by stroke. These aren't the same, I said, my voice thick with anger. They never were, she replied. As we sorted through the chaos, I found something wedged between two folders, unopened letters from a law firm addressed to Alara. 8. I broke the seals and read them. They detailed massive transfers of property and savings accounts into businesses Alara had never even heard of. I grabbed my phone and called the attorney listed on the letterhead. This is Sylvia, I said, identifying myself. I believe my grandmother has been coerced into signing paperwork she never approved. The attorney listened intently, and when I cited specific document numbers and dates, his tone shifted from professional detachment to shock. Those details don't match the files in our office, he said, his voice dropping. Please, do not destroy anything. I need to review every single paper you have. After I hung up, I finally felt the weight of my suspicion lift. Someone else saw the rot too. Late that afternoon, tires crunched across the gravel. A car door slammed. I looked out the window. My father. He didn't even knock this time. He marched through the unlocked screen door, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Alara, open this door. He roared. We didn't move. His voice was cold, lethal. I know you're in there, Sylvia. I opened the door just enough to face him, my back straight. What do you want? Victor's eyes immediately darted past me, searching the house for the evidence. The folder, he spat. Give it to me. What folder? Don't play games with me. Grandma Alara stepped up beside me, her posture suddenly resolute. No, she said. Victor stared at his mother in absolute disbelief. You're letting her tear this family apart. You did that all on your own, Alara answered, her voice steady and quiet. For a long, agonizing moment, the air was thick with tension. Then, Victor pointed a finger at me. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Put those papers back right now. I slid my phone into my pocket, the recording feature already running. If there's nothing wrong with these documents, I asked, why are you so desperate to get them back? Victor answered too quickly, his composure fraying. Because those transfer documents are confidential. I held his gaze without blinking. I never said they were transfer documents. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor realized what he had just admitted, and his expression twisted into something truly terrifying. You're making a monumental mistake, he said, backing away toward his car. If you continue this, there will be devastating consequences. He turned, got into his car, and sped away without another word. I stopped the recording. I finally had the proof that matched the documents on the table. But I also knew that by exposing this, I would be destroying the father I had loved my entire life. My phone rang. It was the attorney. Sylvia, he said, I've reviewed the information you sent. We need you and your grandmother in the office immediately, with investigators. The following morning, we walked into the attorney's office, the metal box and the folder held like shields. 2 investigators were already waiting. We laid out the evidence, and for hours, they dismantled Victor's web of lies. They compared the signatures, tracked the property transfers, and matched the bank records against the falsified filings. When I played the recording of Victor's confrontation, one investigator paused it at the exact moment he referred to the transfer documents. He shouldn't have known what those were, she noted grimly. By the end of the day, the picture was crystal clear. Victor had systematically isolated Alara from her family, intercepted her mail, controlled her medical care, and gaslight everyone around him into believing his mother was losing her mind. He had convinced relatives that her memory was failing so that no one would dare question his sacrifices. While everyone praised him as the devoted son, he was quietly looting her life savings and properties, using forged signatures to funnel everything into businesses he controlled. 10. I sat in silence, every piece of his behavior suddenly clicking into place, his insistence that no one visit, his constant excuses for her silence, his helpful reminders that she needed space. It wasn't protection, it was a cage. The attorney looked at me. If you hadn't shown up that day, the final property transfer would have been finalized by the end of the week. I remembered standing on that porch, feeling her terror, and I finally understood. She wasn't hiding from a stranger, she was fighting to keep the truth from being buried forever. When Victor was eventually questioned, his entire facade collapsed. Every forged signature, every intercepted letter, and his own recorded admissions contradicted every lie he had ever told. The relatives who had once trusted him gathered to hear the findings, and the room was filled with a painful, suffocating silence as they realized how easily they had been fooled. They had accepted Victor's version of events without once asking Alara what she actually wanted. Grandma didn't need to shout, she simply answered their questions, one by one. For the first time in years, no one interrupted her. No one corrected her. No one spoke for her. I watched her reclaim something far more precious than money. She reclaimed her own voice. Authorities froze the disputed assets, and the civil courts began the long process of restoring her home and her life. Victor's reputation vanished overnight. For me, the hardest part wasn't watching him lose his standing, it was accepting that the man I had trusted had spent years manipulating everyone, including me. But I knew I had made the right choice. In the months that followed, Alara began inviting the family back into her life. The photos returned to the mantle, the phone was reconnected, and the silence was finally broken. We visit often, never waiting for an invitation, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes just sitting on the porch in a peace that no longer feels fragile. Looking back, I realized that every lie my father built relied on one single, arrogant assumption, that everyone would keep calling before they visited. I didn't. And that one simple, unexpected decision brought the entire house of cards crashing down. If I had called, Victor would have answered, and the truth would have been buried with my grandmother.